Archival combat footage from 1947 flickers with violent static. A massive steel aircraft carrier violently pitches through black, freezing water. Suddenly, the frame is swallowed by a total whiteout. Through the static, you hear the actual scrambled, panicked radio transmission of a PBM Mariner crew going down blind. The shock of recognition hits hard. This is not World War II combat. This is the United States military fighting the weather and losing. The ice does not care about your radar. You stand on dangerously shifting ground. You trust your global positioning systems, your thermal gear, your deeply ingrained belief that human engineering has conquered nature. But if you do not understand what broke Task Force 68, you remain blind to a terrifying reality. There are vast, silent dead zones on this Earth, where standard physics simply stops supporting human life. Ignorance of nature's absolute supremacy is the first step toward becoming a frontline casualty in a war we cannot win. We are going to tear apart the internet rumors of hidden Nazi flying saucers and subterranean bases. Instead, I'm opening the classified, unredacted field reports from the National Archives. You are about to receive the ultimate tactical briefing on the true cosmic horror of Antarctica. We are looking through the lens of frontline survival at how absolute cold systemically breaks the human mind and permanently destroys our finest war machines. Prepare for deployment into the abyss. The air in the underground vault of the National Archives smells of decaying 50-year-old mission logs. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, the archivist traces a finger over declassified reconnaissance photos from Norfolk Naval Base, 1946. We overlay modern satellite heat maps onto the black and white departure zone. 13 massive steel hulls cut through the water. The film captures the smiling faces of young, sun-tanned sailors, fresh from triumphant Pacific victories. But the archivist knows the terrifying context these young men lack. As we pull the camera back, rocketing up into the stratosphere, the true scale of their vulnerability is revealed. From orbit, this seemingly invincible armada shrinks into a microscopic speck of fragile metal. They are unknowingly marching toward the immense, dead white shield of the Antarctic continent. It is a sterile, indifferent monolith that has swallowed sunlight and silenced biological life for over 30 million years. Digging deeper into the naval registry, a chilling truth emerges. Task Force 68 was never designed as a peaceful scientific jaunt to study penguins and ice cores. It was a heavily armed, aggressive military operation. The Fleet Deployment Manifest lists a staggering inventory: an Essex-class aircraft carrier, an attack submarine, state-of-the-art destroyers, and seaplane tenders. This was an invasion force, packing enough concentrated firepower to level a small European nation. The official objective, buried in the declassified briefing documents, was to test military equipment in frigid conditions and consolidate United States sovereignty. They were attempting to plant a flag on the largest unclaimed landmass remaining on Earth. To the strategic planners in Washington, it was just another blank spot on the map to conquer. But this blank spot covers an area roughly the size of the contiguous United States and Mexico combined, locked under 2 miles of crushing ancient ice. The biological element of this equation was fatally flawed from the moment the anchors weighed. The 4,700 men deployed on these vessels were hardened combat veterans of the Pacific Theater. They were elite fighters, rigorously trained for sweltering jungle warfare and bloody ship-to-ship combat in the tropics. They were entirely unprepared for an alien environment where ambient temperatures could freeze exposed human flesh solid in under 120 seconds. Through the archivist's eyes, reading these yellowed requisition forms is an exercise in escalating dread. They packed the wrong gear, the wrong lubricants, the wrong psychological mindsets. You can see the disaster mathematically encoded in the supply logs before they even hit the ice edge. They were sending boys who had just survived the tropical hellscape of Okinawa straight into a cryogenic meat grinder. The U.S. Navy was sailing thousands of tons of steel directly into a thermodynamic ambush. As the fleet pushed further south, crossing the Antarctic Circle, the very nature of the ocean began to turn hostile. The water thickened into a dark, slushy soup, battering the thin hulls of destroyers designed to hunt submarines in warm waters, not break pack ice. The combat journals transitioned from confident entries about global dominance to nervous observations of the creeping, absolute whiteout surrounding them. The psychological weight of utter isolation began to slowly fracture their morale. The anomaly that haunts the historical record is the sheer asymmetry of the response. The archivist highlights a glaring contradiction in the mission protocol. You do not send a heavily armored submarine and a massive fleet of combat-ready bombers to perform routine weather tests. You deploy a carrier strike group when you expect to encounter fierce, active resistance. But the continent of Antarctica has no indigenous population, no enemy forward operating bases, and no strategic resources to defend. The timing of this massive deployment is the most suspicious piece of the puzzle. Operation Highjump launched in the dead of winter 1946. The global economy was in ruins. The American public was exhausted, rationing supplies, and mourning hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers. The military-industrial complex was supposed to be standing down, demobilizing its massive forces and bringing the surviving heroes home. Instead, they loaded the deck guns and immediately sailed south. All the evidence scattered across this underground vault points to a single, deeply unsettling paradox that defies standard geopolitical logic. We are forced to confront the anomaly head-on before we can truly understand the carnage that followed. Why did the United States government desperately send an aggressive invasion force of 4,700 men to a frozen wasteland completely devoid of enemies, just months after the deadliest war in human history had finally ended? The answer to why we sent an invasion force of 4,700 men to a frozen wasteland is not found in political treaties, but in the sheer, arrogant momentum of a victorious military. We believed our steel and fire could conquer anything. But stepping out of a violently shaking canvas tent on the Ross ice shelf today, bracing against 60-mile-per-hour winds, I feel the exact same primal terror those young sailors felt. We slammed headfirst into a wall of absolute, uncaring frost. Through the frozen goggles of a field researcher, you do not see a pristine winter wonderland. You see an active war zone, where the atmosphere itself is trying to kill you. Every breath instantly freezes in the sub-zero darkness, stinging the lungs like inhaled glass. We intercut this modern survival reality with archival footage from 1946. The fleet crossed the Antarctic Circle, and the rules of engagement instantly changed. Their enemy was no longer human. It was thermodynamics. At minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the mechanical heartbeat of the United States Navy simply stopped. The standard military lubricants that kept machine guns firing and diesel engines turning in the Pacific rapidly degraded. Under these extreme conditions, those oils and greases polymerized, turning into a solid, unyielding glue. Suddenly, state-of-the-art weapon systems and heavy transport vehicles became utterly useless blocks of frozen iron. The war machine was paralyzed by the ambient air. The technological collapse extended far beyond jammed rifles and stalled engines. The sailors, armed with nothing but hand tools, desperately tried to hack accumulating ice off the decks of their destroyers. But the metal itself was betraying them. A wrench strikes a frozen deck fitting and snaps in half like fragile glass. You are witnessing a fundamental breakdown of material science under the crushing weight of extreme cold. These 13 ships were built to absorb torpedo impacts and artillery fire, but they were not designed for heavy ice breaking. At extreme sub-zero temperatures, the structural integrity of standard shipbuilding steel drops by roughly 50%. The molecular lattice of the metal contracts, becoming fatally brittle. Every time a destroyer rammed into an ice floe, the crews braced for catastrophic fracturing. The ocean itself was methodically attempting to crush their unreinforced hulls. Sitting in this violently shaking tent, listening to the ice shelf groan under immense tectonic pressure, the sheer arrogance of Operation Highjump becomes terrifyingly clear. We sent flesh and brittle steel to fight an ancient, indifferent monolith. There is no negotiating with a glacier. There is no overwhelming force you can apply to minus 40 degrees. The military doctrine that defeated fascist empires was completely useless against the sheer, crushing mass of the Antarctic continent. But the mechanical failures in the brittle steel were only the beginning of the horror. The ice did not just break their machines. It began to systematically dismantle their minds. The environment deployed a psychological weapon far more devastating than any artillery barrage. As the fleet pushed deeper into the frozen void, the sky and the ground merged into a single, inescapable abyss. They sailed directly into the sheer psychological terror of the blinding whiteout phenomenon. A whiteout is not a snowstorm. It is a terrifying optical glitch in reality itself. It is a weather condition where uniform illumination from the sky and the snow surface removes all shadows. When the light scatters perfectly, your eyes lose the ability to detect contrast. The horizon vanishes, the ground disappears. It destroys a human's depth perception and spatial orientation completely. You are suddenly trapped in a featureless, infinite void. A pilot steps out of his aircraft onto the ice, takes 3 steps, and instantly loses his balance, tumbling into a trench he could not see. Without shadows, an 80-foot drop looks exactly like a flat sheet of snow. The visual cortex, evolved for tracking predators in the savannah, completely crashes. Men experienced acute vertigo, nausea, and rising panic just walking across a frozen deck. The continent was blinding the invasion force without firing a single shot, breaking their sanity. The front line was no longer a physical beachhead. It was a desperate battle for sanity inside the minds of 4,700 isolated men. The constant sensory deprivation of the whiteout gnawed at their nerves. When you strip away all visual anchors, the brain begins to invent its own reality to fill the void. The absolute silence and the blinding white canvas created a breeding ground for acute paranoia. They were trapped in a sensory vacuum, thousands of miles from any hope of rescue. Standing here on the Ross ice shelf, feeling the wind tear at the canvas, the fragility of the human organism is undeniable. We are tropical apes wrapped in layers of synthetic fabric, pretending we have mastered the Earth. But Task Force 68 proved that our technological mastery is an illusion, easily shattered by a drop in temperature. Their radars were useless, their guns were jammed, and their eyes were continuously betraying them. They were entirely defenseless against the cold. You cannot shoot a blizzard. You cannot bomb a whiteout. The United States Navy, the undisputed master of the global oceans, had sailed into an ambush set by physics itself. The freezing darkness and the blinding light operated in a terrifying tandem, isolating the ships and mentally breaking the crews. Every groaning hull and shattered wrench was a stark reminder of their profound vulnerability. They were not an invasion force. They were hostages to the climate, waiting for the ice to close in. This is the true cosmic horror of the Deep South. It is the sudden, chilling realization that humanity is biologically and technologically incompatible with the brutal, indifferent reality of the Antarctic ice sheet. The continent does not actively hate us. It simply does not acknowledge our existence. We are a microscopic, transient error on its frozen surface. And in 1947, that surface began to actively erase the proudest fleet in the world, dismantling their operational capacity. The survival reports filed by the commanding officers read less like military dispatches and more like the frantic scribblings of trapped men. They watched their logistical superiority crumble into frozen dust within weeks. The hubris of the initial departure was entirely replaced by a desperate, primitive urge to simply survive the deployment. The ice was tightening its grip, turning the most advanced armada on the planet into a fragile collection of stranded, freezing metal outposts. Cut off from the world, blinded by the whiteout, and trapped in slowly freezing ships, the crew's grip on reality began to slip. When the physical world becomes this hostile, the human mind searches for something, anything, to blame. If you cannot fight the cold, you invent an enemy you can shoot at. And in the dark, pinging silence of the sonar rooms, beneath the crushing weight of the ice, that paranoia was about to give birth to a phantom threat that would haunt the world for decades. The pinging in the sonar room of the submarine is erratic. It is a terrifying, claustrophobic heartbeat echoing in the freezing dark. You are submerged beneath an ocean of crushing ice, and your equipment is slowly dying. The mechanical failures topside are bleeding down into the deep water. When a submarine's sensors start failing under the ice shelf, paranoia is not a symptom. It is a raw survival reflex. The crew is blind, cold, and listening to ghosts. Down here in the underground vault of the National Archives, the fluorescent lights flicker over 50-year-old mission logs. The smell of decaying paper is heavy. Tracing a finger across these redacted flight maps reveals vast, terrifying blank spaces labeled only as unknown. Reading these frantic after-action reports reveals a dark truth about the human mind. When a supreme military force suffers inexplicable, humiliating failures, reality becomes too heavy to bear. We cannot accept that the elements are simply crushing us without effort. Human nature desperately prefers the myth of a hidden, super-advanced enemy over the crushing realization of total impotence. We need a villain. We need someone to fight. Because if there is no enemy bunker, no hidden weapon, then we are just dying for nothing in a frozen wasteland. The ice does not care. So the desperate minds of Task Force 68 invented a phantom they could understand. The paranoia did not materialize out of thin air. It grew from a very real, very dangerous seed planted before the world burned. In these declassified files, the origin of the nightmare is clear. The rumors of a hidden fascist stronghold, eventually dubbed Base 211, stemmed from an actual historical event. In 1939, a German mapping expedition probed this exact frozen frontier, calling it New Swabia. That brief pre-war survey mission by the Third Reich was entirely mundane. But in the anxious, fractured reality of 1947, it was the perfect catalyst for hysteria. You are a radar operator sitting in a freezing metal box thousands of miles from home. You know the enemy mapped this ice. You know their leadership vanished into the chaos of the collapsing European theater. The isolation amplifies every shadow. The ice becomes a psychological amplifier for unresolved trauma. Post-war intelligence was a shattered mirror. The Allies had won the surface war, but the oceans were vast, dark, and utterly ungoverned. We possessed virtually no concrete data about the movements of Soviet fleets or remnant fascist submarines escaping the ruins of Europe. Every missing boat was a lingering threat. In the tactical vacuum of the Antarctic theater, that lack of intelligence turned deadly. Ignorance breeds monsters in the deep water. When you are operating blindly under millions of tons of shifting ice, every sonar anomaly transforms into a perceived existential threat. A shifting glacier sounds exactly like a collapsing bulkhead. The crack of freezing ocean water registers as a torpedo tube opening. The sonar operators were not listening to an empty ocean. They were listening to a terrifying, chaotic symphony of crushing pressure and fracturing ice. They interpreted this acoustic chaos through the lens of pure, unadulterated fear. The threat was not external. The invasion was happening inside their own minds. Declassified naval communications from the fleet reveal a terrifying epidemic of psychological collapse. The sheer strain of absolute isolation and constant, crushing sensory deprivation was tearing the crew's sanity apart. When the brain receives no normal input, it manufactures its own terrifying reality. The archive logs document widespread panicked reports of phantom contacts lighting up the radar screens. Watch crews stared into the unrelenting whiteout until their optic nerves misfired, triggering vivid visual hallucinations. They saw impossible aircraft darting through the blizzards. They tracked massive, silent submarines slipping beneath the ice pack. But there was nothing there. It was just the wind, the ice, and the devastating fragility of the human nervous system. This is a combat zone where the enemy is a sensory void. The military machine is designed to process data, identify targets, and neutralize them. But Antarctica offers no data, only a blank, freezing canvas that reflects your deepest terrors right back at you. The men of Task Force 68 were highly trained killers, completely defenseless against the weapons of silence and extreme cold. The command structure was rapidly dissolving into a collective, shivering delusion. A phantom enemy is far deadlier than a real one, because you can never defeat a ghost. You just exhaust your ammunition, burn your precious fuel, and grind your crew down to the breaking point, chasing shadows in the snow. The expedition was hemorrhaging resources not from combat, but from acute weaponized paranoia. Every false alarm consumed vital energy. Every hallucinated submarine dive forced desperate, dangerous maneuvers in deadly waters. You cannot sustain a high-alert combat posture against the weather forever. Eventually, the mind snaps, or the machine breaks. The tragedy of the Antarctic abyss is that while the sailors were looking for imaginary submarines and secret bunkers, the real continent was quietly preparing to strike a fatal, physical blow. The ice does not need a torpedo to kill you. It only needs you to make one mistake. It only needs you to lose focus for a single, fatal second. The true horror is documented right here in these decaying manila folders. The command staff was losing their grip on reality, paralyzed by phantom threats completely blind to the very real physical catastrophe that was rushing up to meet them. The blizzards were closing in, the altimeters were freezing, and the sky was turning to solid white. The continent was done playing psychological games. It was time to draw blood. The command staff was losing their grip on reality, paralyzed by phantom threats, completely blind to the very real physical catastrophe rushing up to meet them. You step out of the archives and onto the metal floorboards of a Martin P. BM Mariner flying boat. The engines roar, but the radar is useless. The paranoid delusions of secret submarine bases suddenly vanish, replaced by the immediate, suffocating terror of raw thermodynamics. The ice is no longer playing psychological games. On December 30th, 1946, the continent finally drew blood, proving with brutal finality that gravity and a severe weather system are vastly deadlier than any anti-aircraft artillery. You look out the cockpit window, and there is nothing. No horizon, no sky, no ground. Just a relentless, blinding void of pure white. The altimeter needle spins violently, desperately trying to find the Earth, but the sensors are completely blinded by the storm. This is the true cosmic horror of the Antarctic theater we saw earlier. You are trapped inside 30 tons of military-grade aluminium, flying blind into that same optical void. Depth perception ceases to exist. Up and down become abstract concepts. The pilots are fighting the yoke, completely unaware that the topography rising beneath them is mathematically invisible to the human eye. The collision happens without any visual warning. At 120 miles per hour, the Mariner, designated as Flight George 1, slams directly into a massive, buried ice ridge on Thurston Island. The sickening crunch of buckling metal drowns out the howling wind for a fraction of a second. The aircraft is instantly shredded, violently ending the debate about who controls this airspace. Nature always retains air superiority. The sheer kinetic force of the impact triggers a catastrophic detonation. Thousands of gallons of highly volatile aviation fuel erupt into a massive fireball, instantly incinerating 3 of the 9 crewmen on board. One moment, they are elite naval aviators operating the pinnacle of human technology. The next, they are reduced to ash, scattered across a frozen, indifferent wasteland. The explosion burns out quickly, swallowed by the infinite, crushing cold of the polar wind. As the smoke clears, the deafening roar of the twin radial engines is replaced by an absolute silence, broken only by the shriek of the blizzard tearing through the shattered fuselage. The 6 surviving men are thrown out onto the ice, coughing up blood and staring at the burning wreckage of their only lifeline. They are no longer soldiers in a triumphant post-war armada. They are incredibly fragile biological organisms, stranded on a completely dead planet. The protocol for a downed aircraft in a standard combat zone involves securing a perimeter, treating the wounded, and waiting for the inevitable rescue chopper. But this is not a standard combat zone. Here, the immediate tactical objective is simply preventing the water inside your own cells from turning into microscopic ice crystals. The survivors are about to endure 13 unyielding days in absolute, unimaginable hell. The temperature plummets to a staggering -60 degrees Fahrenheit. At this extreme thermal deficit, exposed human flesh begins to die in less than 2 minutes. The 6 men desperately salvage torn nylon parachutes, wrapping themselves in the thin fabric and huddling together inside the blackened, twisted remains of the aircraft's tail section to block the lethal wind. To survive, They must completely shut down their military training and rely on primal instinct. They huddle in a tight circle, sharing whatever radiating body heat they have left, while the storm outside attempts to drain the thermal energy right out of their bones. Every shivering breath is a calculated risk, drawing razor-sharp, freezing air into their vulnerable lungs. They are slowly freezing from the inside out, watching their extremities turn black with severe necrosis. Back at the fleet, the command center is in total chaos. The disappearance of George I shatters the illusion of control. Admirals and captains stare at the sprawling, empty maps, realizing that their massive aircraft carrier and advanced destroyers are absolutely useless here. You cannot negotiate with a blizzard, and you cannot shell an ice shelf into submission. The mightiest military force on Earth is entirely paralyzed by millions of tons of frozen water vapor. Rescue operations are immediately launched, but they are repeatedly, brutally delayed by relentless whiteout conditions. The severe weather systems over the continent lock down the sky, grounding every search plane on the carrier deck. This critical failure highlights a terrifying tactical reality. In this theater of operations, the United States military has absolutely zero control over the airspace. Every passing hour drops the survival probability of the George I crew closer to zero. The rescue pilots sit in their cockpits, listening to the wind scream across the flight deck, knowing that their missing comrades are currently being buried alive under drifting snow. The sheer scale of the continent mocks their rescue efforts. Finding a shattered white airplane in a screaming white desert is a mathematical impossibility without a total break in the weather. This 13-day ordeal strips away every ounce of post-war bravado. It proves that human exceptionalism is a myth when confronted with the absolute zero of the polar void. The men of George I were not defeated by Soviet submarines or secret Nazi technology. They were broken by the basic laws of physics. And as the frozen hours tick by, the surviving fleet begins to realize that the ice is just getting started with them. The ice is indeed just getting started with them. Stepping into the freezing cockpit of a Martin PBM Mariner, the glaciology field researcher recognizes a primal terror. The memory of the shattered George I crew hangs heavy in the frozen air. The pilots gripping these yokes know they are a single sensor glitch away from joining those burned, frozen bodies on the ice. But the immediate threat is not the roaring blizzard outside. The true nightmare is unfolding directly on the instrument panel. Every pilot, every sailor, and every explorer on Earth relies on one absolute constant: the magnetic field. It is the invisible tether that pulls you home when your eyes fail. But what happens when the fundamental force that guides every ship and plane on the planet suddenly turns against you? The navigator stares at the primary compass in rising panic. The needle is not pointing north. It is violently spinning, completely detached from reality. You are mathematically lost. Through the eyes of a field researcher, this is the moment human arrogance dies. You are trapped in a metal tube, flying at 150 miles per hour over a featureless, hostile continent. The map is useless. The horizon does not exist. The magnetic compass, the bedrock of modern navigation, has gone completely insane. The needle jerks left, then right, and finally plunges straight down, pointing directly into the crushing ice below your trembling wings. This is not a mechanical failure. This is planetary physics weaponized against human intrusion. Because of their extreme proximity to the South Magnetic Pole, the invisible lines of the Earth's magnetic field do not run parallel to the ground here. They plunge vertically into the crust. The compasses on these aircraft become entirely erratic, pulling violently downwards toward the Earth rather than north. It strips the pilots of their primary orientation tool in an environment where visual navigation is impossible. You cannot navigate by the stars during the blinding 24-hour polar day. You cannot navigate by landmarks when the entire continent is a uniform sheet of crushing white ice. Without a functioning compass, the Martin PBM Mariner is just a blind missile waiting to strike a buried glacier. The crew is utterly severed from the geometry of the known world. When your instruments fail, protocol demands you immediately contact command. The radio operator frantically adjusts the dials, desperate to hear the static-laced voice of the USS Mount Olympus. They need a radar fix. They need a vector home. But instead of human voices, the headset delivers a terrifying, roaring hiss. It is the sound of the void. The radio is completely dead. The invisible umbilical cord connecting this fragile aircraft to the massive fleet has been severed. Once again, the military assumes a technological glitch, but the reality is pure cosmic horror. They are flying through an unprotected atmospheric kill zone. Solar flares, erupting millions of miles away, slam into the Earth. At the equator, our planet's magnetosphere deflects this lethal radiation. But at the poles, this magnetic shield is dangerously weak. The radiation pours straight down into the atmosphere, ionizing the air and creating an impenetrable wall of static. These intense solar storms trigger massive shortwave radio blackouts across the entire polar region. They effectively sever communication between the airborne scouts and the command ships for hours at a time. The fleet is deaf, and the planes are mute. You have pilots flying completely blind, with dead compasses, unable to call for help, screaming over a continent that actively wants to kill them. This is not a battle. This is an execution, orchestrated by the sun itself. The psychological toll of this absolute sensory deprivation is catastrophic. Frontline survival depends on data. When the universe strips away your ability to see, to communicate, and to navigate, the human mind begins to crack. The terror in that cockpit is a raw, biological reaction to an environment that rejects our existence on a molecular level. We are fighting forces that can swallow a 13-ship armada without leaving a single trace on the indifferent ice. If you want to survive the true stories of the world's most hostile environments, secure your lifeline and hit that subscribe button now. If this scale of cosmic indifference blows your mind too, leave a like and let me know in the comments if you think these pilots stood a chance. We are tearing apart the classified archives to show you exactly how nature systematically dismantles human arrogance. Do not fly blind into the next chapter. Join us on this investigation. Back on the flagship, the admirals are receiving fragmented, terrifying reports. Planes are disappearing off the radar. Pilots who do make it back are trembling, reporting compasses that spin in circles and radios blocked by deafening, unnatural frequencies. The military mind is trained to identify a hostile actor. When a seasoned pilot reports that their instruments are being actively jammed, command does not blame the sun. They blame a sophisticated, hidden enemy. It was these highly documented magnetic anomalies and radio dead zones that later conspiracy theorists completely misinterpreted. Decades after the expedition, authors and amateur sleuths would look at these declassified flight logs and see the fingerprints of electromagnetic weapons. They claimed these invisible forces were fired from a subterranean bunker, a fortress buried deep beneath the ice by remnant fascist forces. The truth, however, is far more terrifying. Paranoia is the ultimate defense mechanism against human insignificance. It is deeply comforting to believe that your advanced aircraft was brought down by a superweapon operated by a human adversary. An enemy can be found. An enemy can be bombed. But you cannot drop high explosives on the Earth's magnetic field. You cannot send a battalion of Marines to arrest a solar flare. The military was completely powerless against the cold, unfeeling mechanics of the solar system. Through the lens of a field researcher, you realize the absolute vulnerability of our species. We construct massive steel ships and engineer engines that burn thousands of gallons of fuel, believing this makes us masters of the Earth. But the moment we cross into the Antarctic Circle, our greatest technological achievements become heavy, useless scrap metal. The continent does not fight back. It simply exists, and its mere existence is completely incompatible with our own. The armada is bleeding. Planes are crashing into invisible mountains, and the navigation grids have completely collapsed. Admiral Byrd's invasion force is trapped in a frozen meat grinder, blinded and deafened by the cosmos. But as the frantic scout planes desperately search for a way out of the whiteout, the clouds briefly part. And down below, in the middle of a dead, frozen wasteland, they photograph something completely impossible. Something that defies all logic. You are dropping out of the cloud cover, running on fumes, your magnetic compass completely dead. The cockpit of the Mariner is a cage of pure, suffocating panic. But as the blinding whiteout finally fractures, you do not see the jagged, fatal ice ridges you were bracing for. Instead, you look down and experience a profound, terrifying cognitive dissonance. In the middle of the most hostile, utterly dead ice desert on the planet, the frozen matrix shatters. You see a massive, impossible patch of dark brown earth and deep, unfrozen blue water. This is not a slight seasonal thaw. This is a biological glitch. A warm anomaly sitting right in the throat of a continent that actively murders human beings. The crew of the aircraft stares down in absolute shock. They are freezing to death inside their own fuselage. Yet directly beneath them is a sprawling, steaming oasis. The combat cameras click frantically. Every survival instinct forged in the Pacific theater screams that liquid water at these extreme latitudes is an ambush. A trap set by a hidden adversary. What the flight crews discovered that day was an ice-free region spanning roughly 300 square miles. It is a massive scar of bare rock and liquid lakes completely surrounded by an ocean of lethal, crushing glaciers. We now know this alien landscape as the Bunger Hills Oasis. But to the terrified pilots in 1947, it was proof of the impossible. When the reconnaissance photos hit the command deck and eventually the printing presses back home, the public speculation exploded. The media immediately painted this dark zone as a hidden warm water port. If there is no ice, there must be an artificial heat source. If there is a heat source, someone built it. The military mind desperately wants an enemy to fight. The intelligence officers studied the chaotic maps, convinced they had finally found the legendary Base 211. A subterranean geothermal fortress tapping into the volcanic veins of the Earth to hide a remnant fascist submarine fleet. It is a perfect, terrifying narrative. But the ice is far more ancient and far more indifferent than our petty human wars. Years later, when I finally tracked down the declassified water samples pulled from those unfrozen lakes, the truth shattered the conspiracy theories. There were no hidden submarines. There were no geothermal taps built by rogue engineers. I found no trace of human defiance. Instead, the raw data revealed a completely natural, utterly alien microclimate. The secret of the Bunja Hills oasis is a brutal lesson in extreme thermodynamics. The massive ridges of dark, exposed rock act as a colossal thermal battery. Under the relentless 24-hour bombardment of the Antarctic summer sun, this stone absorbs massive amounts of solar radiation. It cooks the surrounding ice, carving out a temporary sanctuary in the wasteland. There is no superweapon here, just the raw, unthinking mechanics of geology and starlight. But standing on the edge of those dark lakes, you do not feel relief. You feel a crushing sense of insignificance, because the water is not empty. The military came looking for a hidden empire, and they completely missed the actual, silent inhabitants of this oasis. The extreme, punishing isolation of this region provides a terrifying glimpse into deep time. This valley is a locked biological vault. The organic data we pulled from these lakes reveals an ecosystem completely severed from the rest of the global biosphere. It is a parallel track of evolution, operating in absolute darkness during the long, lethal polar winters. We discovered ancient, thriving microbial life that has existed here, undisturbed, for millions of years. They survived the violent shifting of tectonic plates. They survived the freezing of the entire continent. They are a resilient, alien biology functioning perfectly in an environment that snaps human steel and freezes human blood in a matter of minutes. Look closely at this unfrozen dirt. This is the true cosmic horror of the Antarctic. These microscopic survivors do not care about the United States Navy. They do not care about radar or aircraft carriers or the fragile egos of the men flying above them. They have ruled this dark water since long before the first ape stood upright, and they will remain long after we are gone. The Armada found no enemies to shoot at the bottom of the world. They found only an ancient, indifferent silence that mocked their heavy artillery. But this brief summer anomaly was merely a geological trap. The 24-hour sun is already dipping toward the horizon. The dark rock is cooling, and the true, lethal grip of the Antarctic winter is about to crush the entire fleet. The dark rock of the oasis was cooling rapidly. Down here in the National Archives vault, under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, you can almost feel that temperature drop creeping through the declassified logs. The reports from late February 1947 do not read like military dispatches. They read like a frantic countdown. The true, lethal grip of the Antarctic winter was closing its jaws around the entire fleet. I am looking at the tactical map recovered from the bridge of the flagship, the USS Mount Olympus. It is covered in desperate red grease pencil marks. Each red cross is a grounded plane. Each circled coordinate is a damaged ship. You hear the sound of a steel hull screaming, buckling under the immense, unyielding pressure of the ice. Admiral Richard Byrd is staring at this map, realizing his armada is trapped in a dying ocean. Operation Highjump was designed as an overwhelming projection of power. The Pentagon slated this deployment to last anywhere from 6 to 8 months. They brought enough provisions, heavy artillery, and manpower to sustain a prolonged invasion of the continent. But the documents in these cardboard boxes tell a completely different story. After a mere 8 weeks on the ice, the greatest navy on Earth simply packed up, turned its back, and fled. Why does an armada of 13 heavily armed ships and 4,700 combat-hardened veterans suddenly sound a full retreat without firing a single shot at an enemy? Conspiracy theorists have spent decades filling this void with tales of subterranean Nazi bases, and alien repulsor lift technology. But the truth, buried in the logistics logs, is far more terrifying. We were not defeated by a secret weapon. We were defeated by thermodynamics. Out on the water, the temperature was plummeting drastically. The ocean itself was beginning to weaponize. As the brief polar summer collapsed, the surface water was undergoing a violent phase change. The rapid approach of the Antarctic winter threatened to permanently lock the fleet in a crushing vice of sea ice. And these vessels were completely naked against this geological threat. You have to understand the catastrophic vulnerability of this fleet. With the exception of a few specialized icebreakers, these were standard warships built for the warm waters of the Pacific Theater. They had thin, unreinforced hulls. As the sea ice thickened, the pressure exerted on the steel was astronomical. The ice does not attack. It simply expands with mathematical certainty, exerting millions of pounds of pressure per square inch. If the USS Mount Olympus and the flanking destroyers did not break out immediately, they would be permanently entombed. The expanding ice would effortlessly pop their structural rivets, fracture their keels, and drag thousands of sailors down into the freezing black abyss. The enemy was not shooting at them from a bunker. The enemy was the water they were floating in, transforming into an unstoppable, continent-sized, crushing machine. But the encroaching ice was only the outer perimeter of their collapse. I am pulling the daily quartermaster reports from the archive folders. The ink is faded, but the panic is absolute. Logistics logs from the mission show a critical, mathematically impossible depletion of aviation fuel. The extreme cold was destroying the chemical integrity of their supply lines. The very lifeblood of their air superiority was turning to useless sludge. It was not just the fuel lines failing. It was the metal. It was the gears. The rate of mechanical failure had reached an entirely unsustainable trajectory. We are talking about engines seizing, hydraulics shattering like glass, and communication arrays snapping off in the wind. The United States military machine was literally freezing to death on the ice shelf. Every day they remained, they lost another percentage of their operational capability. This is the ultimate cosmic horror of Operation Highjump. You can drop atomic bombs on cities. You can sink enemy fleets. But you cannot negotiate with absolute zero. You cannot outgun a blizzard. Admiral Byrd realized that his force was bleeding to death from 1,000 environmental cuts. The order to retreat was not an act of cowardice. It was the only mathematical equation that ended with his men surviving the deployment. The fleet limped back to civilization, battered, freezing, and fundamentally broken by the elements. But the geopolitical panic did not end at the ice shelf. Upon his return to Washington, Admiral Byrd was summoned before Congress. He delivered a stark, chilling warning that would be twisted by pop culture for the next 80 years. He stated categorically that the United States could be attacked by aircraft flying directly over the poles. To the paranoid public of 1947, already primed by science fiction, this sounded like a cryptic warning about an advanced Antarctic threat. But look at the geopolitical reality of the classified briefing. Byrd was not talking about flying saucers. He was looking at the shortest, most direct flight path between the Soviet Union and the American heartland. His warning was a bleak assessment of new, long-range intercontinental bomber capabilities. He had just witnessed how entirely defenseless the United States Navy was in polar conditions. If Soviet bombers attacked over the Arctic or Antarctic circles, American forces would freeze before they could ever fire an anti-aircraft gun. The ice had humiliated them, and Byrd knew the next great war would be fought in the very environment that had just defeated his entire armada. The geopolitical panic faded, and the armada retreated to warmer waters, leaving behind a silence so absolute it feels like a physical weight. Look at the Antarctic ice sheet today. It looks exactly as it did millions of years ago, completely untouched, completely unbothered by the intrusion of 4,700 men. We brought the greatest military machine ever constructed to the bottom of the world, and the continent simply swallowed our footprints. Somewhere out there in the freezing dark, beneath decades of accumulated snowfall, the rusted carcass of a 1940s tractor is being slowly chewed to dust by the grinding teeth of a glacier. It is the only monument to our presence. The casualties of Task Force 68, the shattered hulls, the frozen engines, none of it mattered to the ice. We declared war on a biome, and the biome did not even register our attack. The storm has passed, and we are nothing. We started this investigation looking through the lens of military archivists and frontline radar operators, trying to find a tactical reason for an impossible defeat. But you and I have to step back now and look at the actual battlefield. The true horror of Operation Highjump is not what we found in the ice. It is what the ice revealed about us. We are fragile, biological anomalies trying to enforce our political will on a planet governed by the cold math of thermodynamics. Even now, in the year 2026, Operation Highjump remains the largest single expedition to Antarctica in all of human history. For 80 years, no nation has ever attempted to send an armada of that scale back into the deep freeze. We learned our lesson. You can split the atom, you can map the human genome, and you can build artificial intelligence, but you cannot negotiate with absolute zero. You cannot conquer thermodynamics with a fleet of steel destroyers. As a species, we are the survivors of an evolutionary gauntlet, heavily reliant on our technology to act as our armor. We wrap ourselves in Kevlar, radar, and satellite uplinks, convincing ourselves that we have mastered the Earth. But when you strip away the thermal gear and the GPS navigation, you are just a mammal standing on a dead rock. Our technology is a temporary truce with nature, not a victory. And Antarctica is the place where that truce is violently revoked. This brings us to the ultimate question of why we still talk about hidden subterranean bases and alien craft hiding under the Ross ice shelf. The answer is a protective psychological mechanism. The conspiracy theories endure because it is deeply, fundamentally easier for humans to imagine a secret cabal of advanced villains than to face the void. We would rather believe we were defeated by a superweapon than accept that our finest technology was destroyed by frozen water. If the enemy has a face, even an alien or a fascist one, we can understand it. We can build a better bomb. We can plan a counterattack. But if the enemy is just a severe drop in barometric pressure and a whiteout that strips away your spatial orientation, there is no one to fight. That is the essence of cosmic dread. The realization that we live on a spinning globe that features massive, sprawling regions completely and aggressively hostile to our biological existence. The Earth is not our mother. It is a terrifyingly indifferent geological engine. We survived the Ice Age, we built cities, and we launched satellites, but we only did so in the thin, temperate margins of this world. The poles are a stark reminder of the planet's default state: cold, dark, and lethal. We went to the bottom of the world looking for enemies to fight, only to discover that the Earth itself is the supreme, undefeated power. The void simply stares back at us. And yet, we cannot simply ignore this hostile frontier. Today, crushed beneath 2 miles of ancient, shifting ice, the Antarctic continent holds 90% of the Earth's fresh water. It is a sleeping giant of planetary physics. It does not actively hunt us, but its mere existence dictates our future. The thermal expansion of the oceans, the shifting of global currents, the very survival of our coastal cities, all of it is tethered to this massive, frozen wasteland. As global climates shift and the deep freeze begins to destabilize, the ice will not stay confined to the bottom of the map. It will reach out. The melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet alone holds the potential to rewrite the borders of every nation on Earth without firing a single shot. The water locked in that ice is the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, and it operates on a time scale that our political election cycles cannot even begin to comprehend. So, we stand on the shoreline, watching the tide gauges, waiting for the fallout of a war we never actually won. We retreat to our safe zones, clutching our digital devices, pretending that the infrastructure we built is permanent. But the ice reminds us that permanence is a human illusion. Every concrete bunker, every aircraft carrier, every server farm holding our collective digital history is completely vulnerable to the deep, slow breathing of the Earth's climate system. Think about the sheer arrogance of Task Force 68. We brought fuel that froze, steel that shattered, and compasses that spun wildly in the face of the magnetic pole. We treated a force of nature like a geopolitical rival. The men who survived that deployment came home with severe frostbite and a profound silence, carrying the traumatic realization that human supremacy is a geographic privilege. We are allowed to exist here. We do not rule absolutely anywhere. We are the species that demands answers, that needs a narrative where we are the central characters of the universe. But Antarctica refuses to give us that narrative. It offers no closure, no final battle, and no glorious victory. It only offers survival or death, dictated by the relentless drop of the thermometer. The cosmic horror is not that something is hiding in the ice. The horror is that the ice is exactly what it appears to be: an unthinking, unfeeling executioner. The era of geographic conquest is over, but the era of climatic reckoning is just beginning. We have to look at these raw historical failures with our eyes wide open if we want to survive the next century. If this deep dive into the true historical classified files gave you a new perspective on our fragile place on this planet, hit the subscribe button. Join us in the archives. We are going to keep tracking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or terrifying it gets. The declassified files of Operation Highjump will eventually crumble into dust. The names of the sailors who froze to death in the wreckage of George I will fade from living memory. But the ice will remain. It will continue to grind the mountains into powder, perfectly indifferent to the flags we plant or the maps we draw. We brought the fire of a world war to the ice shelf, and the ice simply absorbed it, extinguishing our collective hubris in a matter of weeks. In the end, we did not conquer the final frontier. We merely survived our brief exposure to it. The Earth has drawn a line in the snow, a boundary where our biology and our ambitions are rendered entirely obsolete. We are temporary residents on a beautiful, hostile rock, and the void is always waiting just beyond the tree line. The storm has passed, the true casualties have been counted, and the ice remains undefeated. Signing off.